Central Iowa, 1878. While every homesteader burned precious lumber to keep warm, Norwegian immigrant Lars Halvorsen was loading his stove with something his neighbors called waste, dried corn cobs. They laughed at him, called it desperate, said real fuel meant split wood, not crop refuse. Halvorsen had spent 2 months perfecting his method, a modified cook stove with a sheet iron baffle and controllable draft, fed with carefully measured baskets of bone-dry cobs. His neighbors burned 4 cords of green cottonwood each winter, struggling to keep their cabins above 50 degrees. Then December arrived with 10 straight days of bitter cold. Nighttime temperatures dropped to 25 below zero. Daytime highs stayed in single digits. Conventional wood heating failed. Neighbors burned through cord after cord of hissing, low-output green wood just to maintain 48 degrees inside. But Halvorsen's cabin? 66 degrees on the coldest nights, burning nothing but the cobs everyone else threw away. His fuel cost was zero, his labor was half, and he was saving every stick of buildable timber for the machine shed he planned to frame come spring. What did this sawmill-trained farmer understand about heat, efficiency, and prairie survival that turned agricultural waste into the most reliable fuel on the frontier? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and state. We love reading where these documentaries reach. The spirit thermometer hanging by the cabin door read 8 degrees below zero when Lars Halvorsen stepped outside at dawn, his breath forming instant clouds in the December air. Through the frost, smoke rising from his neighbor Thomas Keating's chimney a quarter-mile away, he could see the dark outline of another homestead struggling against the Iowa winter. Back inside his own cabin, the same thermometer showed 58 degrees, a difference that would have seemed impossible to most settlers in Polk County. Halvorsen moved to his modified No. 7 cook stove, where coals from the night's last feeding still glowed beneath a thin layer of ash. The stove bore little resemblance to the standard models his neighbors used. A sheet iron baffle plate, 3/16 of an inch thick and bent to precise angles, hung suspended inside the firebox from 2 bolts he had threaded himself. Below it, a sliding draft gate he had fabricated from scrap metal allowed him to control airflow with the precision of a sawmill operator, which he had been before taking up his homestead claim. He pulled 3 peck baskets from their place beside the stove, each filled with corn cobs dried to the consistency of kindling. The cobs represented the byproduct of shelling 40 acres of corn that had yielded 35 bushels per acre, a weathered but respectable harvest that left him with an estimated 50 to 60 bushel equivalents of what most farmers considered waste. As he began measuring the morning's fuel charge, Halvorsen opened his ledger and noted the time, the outside temperature, and the weight of cobs he intended to burn. These measurements had become routine over the past 2 months, part of a systematic approach to heating that drew on both his Norwegian heritage and his years working around combustion systems. The previous winter had taught him hard lessons about fuel economy on the prairie. With the nearest substantial timber stand more than 6 miles away, he had burned through nearly 4 cords of mostly green cottonwood, wood that produced heavy smoke, low heat, and consumed his time in constant trips to distant woodlots. This year's approach grew from a simple calculation. Every sound stick of lumber he could avoid burning represented material for the machine shed he planned to frame come spring. A single 2x4 burned for warmth was a 2x4 he would have to purchase or haul from increasingly distant sources. The mockery from his neighbors had been consistent and vocal. At the community fanning mill where farmers gathered to clean grain, Thomas Keating had made his position clear to anyone within earshot. "Cobs are for kindling, not heat," the township trustee and sawyer had declared, his authority backed by years of cutting stovewood from creek bottoms and understanding local timber. The sentiment was echoed by Samuel Avery and others who viewed wood as the only legitimate fuel for serious heating. To them, Halvorsen's careful collection and cribbing of corn cobs represented either desperation or foolishness, possibly both. But Halvorsen's reasoning extended beyond simple economy. His experience in Norwegian sawmills had taught him to think systematically about combustion, and his understanding of moisture content, BTU output, and controlled burn rates informed every aspect of his cob burning method. He had spent the late summer and early fall perfecting his technique, learning that dry cobs delivered approximately 8,000 BTUs per pound when burned properly, a respectable heat value that required only careful management to extract efficiently. The key lay in the modifications he had made to his cook stove and the feeding regimen he had developed through trial and error. The sheet iron baffle created turbulence in the hot gases, increasing their residence time in the firebox and improving heat transfer to the stove body before exhaust. The sliding draft gate allowed him to maintain the precise airflow needed to keep his stack temperature between 400 and 525 degrees, hot enough for complete combustion but controlled enough to prevent the rapid fuel consumption and potential stove damage that came with unregulated burning. His feeding schedule had been refined to 6 to 8 pounds of cobs per hour during the coldest nights, delivered in small charges of 1 to 2 pounds every 10 to 12 minutes. This frequent but measured approach prevented the explosive burns that could warp thin cast iron and maintained the steady radiant heat that kept his cabin comfortable. The technique required attention, but far less labor than the constant wood hauling his neighbors endured. As morning light strengthened, Halverson could see Keating's hired man making another trip to the woodpile, the 18th or 20th such trip in the past day, by his count. The contrast was stark. Where his neighbors spent their winter days in constant fuel management, hauling, splitting, and feeding their stoves every 40 minutes to maintain minimal comfort, his cob system required only 8 to 10 basket charges per day and maintained temperatures that allowed normal household activities without the heavy clothing his neighbors wore indoors. The technical principles behind his success were straightforward but precise. Corn cobs, when properly dried and stored, offered high surface area for rapid ignition and consistent burn characteristics when fed steadily rather than in large batches. His baffle system captured heat that would otherwise escape up the chimney, while his draft control prevented the runaway fires that wasted fuel and stressed equipment. The result was a heating system that operated on agricultural waste while delivering superior performance to conventional wood burning. By mid-morning, with his cabin maintaining its comfortable temperature on a steady diet of measured cob charges, Halverson returned to his ledger to record the morning's fuel consumption and indoor temperature readings. The numbers told a story that would soon prove more compelling than his neighbor's skepticism, but for now he remained content to perfect his system in relative solitude, confident that the winter ahead would provide ample opportunity to demonstrate the worth of burning what others discarded. The high-pressure system that settled over central Iowa in mid-December brought the kind of cold that tested every heating system on the prairie. For 10 consecutive days, nighttime temperatures plunged to 15 below zero, sometimes reaching 25 below in the hours before dawn. Daytime highs struggled to reach single digits above zero, creating conditions that pushed fuel consumption beyond what most homesteaders had planned for the entire winter. Thomas Keating found himself burning through nearly a cord of wood every 8 to 10 days, a rate that would exhaust his winter supply before February if the pattern continued. The cottonwood he had cut from creek bottoms in late autumn still retained enough moisture to hiss and steam when split, producing the heavy smoke and low heat output that characterized greenwood combustion. Each morning brought the same routine: multiple trips to the woodpile, constant attention to a fire that seemed to consume fuel faster than it produced meaningful warmth, and the growing realization that his conventional approach was failing to match the severity of the weather. At breakfast time in Keating's cabin, the thermometer mounted on the interior wall typically read between 44 and 48 degrees Fahrenheit, temperatures that required his family to wear heavy clothing indoors and made simple tasks like preparing meals or mending clothes uncomfortable ordeals. Maintaining even this marginal warmth demanded that someone tend the stove every 40 minutes throughout the night, feeding it split wood in a constant battle against heat loss through chinking gaps and single wall construction. Similar struggles played out in cabins across the township. Samuel Avery had begun burning green poles cut from his own creek bottom, wood so freshly cut that it produced more steam than flame when placed in his firebox. The Whitcomb family, where the district school teacher boarded, had started burning fence rails to supplement their dwindling supply of seasoned wood. Each household faced the same mathematical reality. Conventional wood-burning systems designed for typical Iowa winters were inadequate for sustained extreme cold. Meanwhile, Lars Halvorsson's heating regimen continued with methodical precision. During the worst nights, when outdoor temperatures dropped to 25 below, he increased his cob feeding rate to 6 to 8 pounds per hour, delivered in small, frequent charges that maintained consistent heat output without overwhelming his modified stove. His feeding schedule required charges of 1 to 2 pounds every 10 to 12 minutes, a routine that demanded attention but produced remarkable results. The flue thermometer he had mounted on his stovepipe consistently showed stacked temperatures between 400 and 525 degrees, indicating efficient combustion with minimal waste heat escaping up the chimney. His sliding draft gate remained approximately one-third open during the coldest periods, providing enough airflow for complete combustion while preventing the runaway fires that could warp his stove's cast iron components. Most significantly, his interior temperatures remained stable between 63 and 66 degrees Fahrenheit throughout the 10-day cold snap, a 15 to 18 degree advantage over comparable cabins using conventional wood heating. These measurements, recorded at the same 5-foot height and central location that Mary Whitcomb used for her temperature logs, represented the difference between genuine comfort and mere survival. The technical explanation for this superior performance lay in the combustion characteristics of properly prepared corn cobs. Each pound of bone-dry cob material delivered approximately 8,000 BTUs when burned with adequate airflow, a respectable heat value that compared favorably to many wood species. More importantly, the high surface area of cob material allowed for rapid ignition and quick heat release directly into the room, rather than requiring the extended burn times that sent much of wood's energy up the chimney before it could warm the living space. Halvorsson's baffle system proved crucial during these extreme conditions. The sheet iron plate suspended in his firebox increased the residence time of hot combustion gases, allowing more complete heat transfer to the stove body before exhaust. This modification, combined with his controlled feeding regimen, meant that a higher percentage of each fuel charge's energy heated his cabin rather than escaping through the chimney. The contrast became most apparent during the night hours, when maintaining indoor temperatures required the most fuel input. While his neighbors struggled with the 40-minute feeding cycles necessary to keep wood fires burning, Halvorsson's system operated efficiently on 10 to 12-minute intervals with lighter fuel charges. The frequent but small additions of cobs maintained steady combustion temperatures and prevented the heat cycling that plagued wood-burning stoves during extreme weather. His fuel consumption during this 10-day period averaged 80 to 95 pounds of cobs daily, roughly equivalent to 6 to 7 bushels by volume using the standard measurements familiar to corn farmers. This represented a fraction of his total cob inventory, while his neighbors were burning through their winter wood supplies at unsustainable rates. More crucially, every day of the cold snap represented another day of preserved lumber for his spring construction projects. The efficiency gains extended beyond simple fuel economy. Halvorsson's lower firing frequency meant fewer trips outside in dangerous cold, reduced labor compared to the constant wood handling his neighbors endured, and more stable indoor conditions for essential winter activities like cooking, mending, and maintaining equipment. His cabin remained comfortable enough for normal household tasks throughout the crisis, while neighboring households struggled to maintain basic warmth. As the 10-day pattern finally began to break, showing slight moderation in overnight lows, the cumulative effects of different heating strategies had become measurable and obvious. Halvorsson's systematic approach to fuel management and combustion control had not only proven more economical, but had delivered superior performance precisely when conventional methods faced their greatest test. The question was no longer whether burning cobs could work, but whether his skeptical neighbors would recognize the evidence accumulating in his daily temperature logs. The formal documentation of the heating comparison began when Mary Whitcomb produced a standardized measurement protocol that satisfied both participants and observers. Her experience maintaining attendance logs and weather records for the district school had taught her the importance of eliminating variables that could compromise data reliability. She established that both cabins would use identical thermometer. Placement: 5 feet above floor level at the geometric center of each room, and that temperature readings would be recorded at fixed intervals throughout each 24-hour period. Thomas Keating, despite his initial skepticism about cob burning, agreed to serve as an official witness to the trial. recognizing that his position as township trustee lent credibility to whatever results emerged. His practical knowledge of local timber species, cord measurements, and fuel costs made him qualified to evaluate the economic implications of any heating method that proved technically successful. More importantly, his reputation for conservative judgment meant that his eventual endorsement would carry weight with settlers who remained doubtful about unconventional approaches. The trial's design reflected the careful methodology that frontier communities applied to questions affecting survival and resource allocation. Avery's cabin would operate for alternating 24-hour periods using either conventional wood burning or the modified cob system, with identical weather conditions ensuring fair comparison. Sorensen had fabricated a removable baffle assembly that could be installed or withdrawn as needed, allowing the same stove to demonstrate both heating methods without introducing equipment variables. Documentation procedures established by Whitcomb required recording not only interior temperatures, but also fuel consumption rates, labor requirements, and qualitative observations about combustion characteristics, smoke production, and operational demands. Her systematic approach reflected the emerging agricultural science movement that was beginning to apply measurement and controlled comparison to traditional farming practices. The heating trial would produce the kind of quantitative evidence that could guide practical decisions rather than relying on tradition or assumption. The first complete cycle, conducted during a particularly severe cold snap with overnight lows reaching 22 below zero, yielded results that exceeded even Halverson's expectations. The wood-burning configuration, using Avery's supply of green cottonwood, maintained interior temperatures averaging 47 degrees Fahrenheit, despite consuming nearly 2/10 of a cord in 24 hours. The constant feeding requirements meant that someone had to tend the fire every 35 to 40 minutes throughout the night, making adequate rest impossible for the household. When the same cabin switched to cob burning for the following 24-hour period under nearly identical weather conditions, the performance improvement was immediately apparent. Interior temperatures averaged 64 degrees Fahrenheit while consuming approximately 90 pounds of dried cobs, roughly 7 bushels by volume. The stable combustion characteristics allowed feeding intervals of 12 to 15 minutes during peak demand periods, enabling normal sleep cycles while maintaining superior warmth. Fuel preparation and handling requirements revealed additional advantages of the cob system that went beyond simple heat output comparisons. Green cottonwood required splitting immediately before use to expose dry interior surfaces, a task that became increasingly difficult as temperatures dropped and wood fibers hardened. Cobs required no processing beyond the initial shelling and drying, allowing fuel preparation to occur during favorable weather rather than as an emergency response to heating demands. The labor analysis conducted by Whitcomb showed that wood burning required 22 trips to the outdoor fuel supply during the 24-hour test period, each trip exposing household members to dangerous cold while carrying 40 to 50 pounds of split wood. Cob burning required only 9 fuel-gathering trips, each involving 10 to 12 pounds of material that could be collected in covered baskets and pre-positioned near the stove during moderate weather. Stack temperature monitoring provided technical insights that explained the superior performance of properly managed cob combustion. Halverson's flue thermometer consistently showed exhaust temperatures between 425 and 500 degrees Fahrenheit during optimal operation, hot enough for complete combustion, but controlled enough to maximize heat transfer to the room before gases escaped up the chimney. Wood burning in the same stove typically produced more erratic temperatures, ranging from below 300 degrees during smoldering periods to over 600 degrees during peak combustion phases. The creosote comparison that Sorensen conducted after both test periods revealed significantly less flue fouling with cob burning. Using a simple rag wipe technique to sample chimney deposits, he documented approximately 30% less accumulation from the cob system. This difference reflected both the drier fuel characteristics and the more consistent combustion temperatures that prevented the cool burning conditions that produced heavy creosote formation. Safety considerations emerged as an important factor distinguishing the two heating methods. Wood burning, particularly with green fuel, created unpredictable heat cycling that could stress cast iron components and produce dangerous temperature fluctuations in living spaces. Cob burning, when properly managed, delivered steadier heat output with lower risk of equipment damage or thermal shock to stove components. However, the trial also documented important operational requirements that prevented casual adoption of cob burning by inexperienced users. Successful operation demanded understanding the relationship between draft settings, fuel charge sizes, and stack temperatures, knowledge that required learning and practice to master. Improper feeding techniques could produce rapid temperature spikes that warped stove lids or created unsafe exhaust conditions. Storage. Requirements for cobs proved more demanding than wood fuel preparation. Maintaining the bone-dry condition necessary for efficient combustion required proper cribbing with adequate ventilation and protection from precipitation. Cobs that absorbed moisture produced poor heat output and excessive smoke, making fuel quality control essential for system performance. The cost analysis that concluded the formal trial provided compelling economic justification for cob adoption among corn-growing homesteaders. The wood fuel consumed during the test period represented approximately $4 worth of purchased timber at current market rates, while the cobs represented agricultural waste with no market value beyond their heating application. For farmers with adequate corn production, the fuel cost advantage was complete. Zero expenditure for heating fuel versus significant ongoing costs for purchased or harvested wood. The documentation assembled by Whitcomb and witnessed by Keating provided the foundation for broader community consideration of cob burning as a legitimate heating method rather than an experimental curiosity. The crisis that transformed community attitudes toward cob burning arrived with a 3-day wind that drove sustained gusts of 25 to 30 miles per hour across the Iowa prairie. The combination of 20 below temperatures and relentless wind created effective conditions approaching 40 below zero, dangerous enough to kill exposed livestock and push conventional heating systems beyond their operational limits. Families throughout the township found their wood-burning stoves inadequate to maintain even minimal interior warmth against the sustained assault of wind-driven cold. Dr. Rebecca Gaines, riding her medical circuit despite the dangerous conditions, documented the crisis as it unfolded in cabin after cabin. At the Whitcomb household, where she stopped to check on an elderly boarder, indoor temperatures had dropped to 43 degrees despite burning fence rails and furniture to supplement their exhausted wood supply. The physician's case notes recorded similar conditions throughout her route. Households where infants and elderly residents showed early signs of hypothermia despite families' desperate efforts to maintain heat. Samuel Avery arrived at Halverson's door near midnight of the second day, carrying his 6-year-old daughter wrapped in every blanket he owned. The child had developed a rattling cough that worsened in the 40-degree interior of their cabin, where green wood burned so poorly that continuous feeding barely maintained combustion. Avery's request was simple. Could the cob-heated cabin provide a warm place for the child to recover while the brutal weather continued? Halverson's response demonstrated both the technical superiority of his heating system and the community obligations that governed frontier survival. His cabin, maintained at 64 degrees throughout the windstorm, easily accommodated the additional occupants while requiring only slight adjustments to his feeding regimen. The child's improvement was immediate and measurable. Her labored breathing eased within hours of exposure to genuinely warm air, and her fever began breaking by morning. Word of the successful shelter spread quickly through the isolated community, bringing additional requests for emergency housing. The Keating family's elderly grandfather, suffering from joint pain that worsened dramatically in cold conditions, joined the growing group of temporary residents who found relief in the consistently heated space. Mary Whitcomb, despite her earlier skepticism about unconventional heating methods, brought her teaching materials to continue lessons in the warm cabin when the schoolhouse became too cold for effective instruction. The operational requirements of hosting multiple residents provided Halverson with opportunities to demonstrate the practical techniques that made cob burning successful. He showed visitors how to sort cobs by size for even combustion, selecting pieces that would burn completely within 12 to 15 minutes, rather than leaving partially burned residue that could obstruct airflow. Pre-warming fuel charges on the back surface of the stove ensured rapid ignition and prevented the temperature drops that occurred when cold fuel was added to active fires. His most critical instruction involved ash bed management, maintaining approximately 1 inch of accumulated ash that served as an insulating buffer, preventing direct contact between fresh fuel and the metal grate. This technique prevented the rapid burning that could produce dangerous temperature spikes while ensuring adequate airflow for complete combustion. Visitors learned to stir the ash bed hourly during peak burning periods and clear the grate completely every 6 to 8 hours to prevent obstruction. The baffle template that Sorensen had developed became a subject of intense interest as neighbors recognized the system's superior performance under extreme conditions. The blacksmith's design, an 11-inch by 15-inch bent plate suspended from 2 bolts, created a 3-inch gas turn under the stovepipe that significantly improved heat extraction from combustion gases. Several visitors sketched the configuration for later replication, while others took measurements of the draft gate mechanism that allowed precise airflow control. Fuel storage and preparation techniques became practical knowledge that visitors could immediately apply to their own situations. Halverson explained the critical importance of maintaining bone-dry cobs through proper cribbing, storage elevated at least 12 inches above ground level, with cross-stacking that promoted air circulation and prevented moisture absorption. Wet cobs produced disappointing heat output and excessive smoke, making fuel quality control essential for successful operation. The feeding regimen that maintained consistent heat output required understanding relationships between fuel charge size, combustion air, and stack temperature that most wood burners had never considered. Halverson demonstrated the technique of never loading a full scuttle of cobs at once, explaining that steady heat required frequent small additions rather than large batches that could overwhelm the stove's thermal capacity. Cast iron responded better to consistent temperatures than to rapid cycling between hot and cold conditions. Stack temperature monitoring became a teachable skill that prevented both underperformance and equipment damage. Using his flue thermometer, Halverson showed visitors how to maintain exhaust temperatures between 425 and 525 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough for efficient combustion but controlled enough to prevent warpage of thin cast iron components. The visual and audible changes in flame characteristics provided additional feedback for operators learning to manage cob fires effectively. Safety considerations received particular attention as more households prepared to adopt the heating method. Halverson warned against the rapid temperature rises that could occur if operators lost control of feeding rates or draft settings. Thin cast iron stove lids from inexpensive imports showed heat rippling if stack temperatures consistently exceeded 575 degrees, providing visual warning of potentially dangerous conditions. The community response during the 3-day crisis created a network of shared knowledge that accelerated adoption beyond what any individual demonstration could have achieved. Neighbors who had dismissed cob burning as desperate improvisation found themselves requesting detailed instructions for modifying their own stoves and establishing proper fuel storage systems. The transformation from mockery to adoption occurred within days, rather than the gradual seasonal change that typically characterized new agricultural practices. By the time the sustained wind finally moderated and temperatures began their slow recovery toward normal winter levels, 5 households had committed to implementing cob burning systems as their primary heating method. The crisis had provided proof that exceeded any theoretical argument. When survival demanded maximum heating efficiency from available resources, the unconventional approach had delivered results that conventional wisdom could not match. The transformation from emergency shelter to community practice occurred with remarkable speed once the immediate crisis passed. By February, 5 households had successfully implemented cob burning systems, guided by the detailed instructions and hardware modifications that Halverson and Sorensen had refined through repeated demonstration. The combined fuel savings across these adopting families represented approximately 2.5 cords of usable construction lumber preserved over a single month, material that would otherwise have been consumed maintaining marginal interior temperatures. Temperature measurements collected by Mary Whitcomb across the adopting households showed consistent results that validated the controlled trial findings. Follower cabins reported nighttime temperature lows between 61 and 67 degrees Fahrenheit during the same extreme weather patterns that had previously produced interior readings of 46 to 52 degrees with wood burning. The 15-degree improvement remained constant across different cabin sizes and construction variations, suggesting that the heating method's advantages were inherent rather than dependent on specific building characteristics. Economic benefits extended far beyond simple fuel cost savings, creating ripple effects throughout the township's resource allocation. Time previously spent hauling timber from distant woodlots was redirected to fence construction, equipment maintenance, and other infrastructure improvements that had been deferred during the consuming demands of winter fuel management. The Avery household alone reported saving 12 hours weekly in wood-gathering labor, time that Samuel invested in preparing materials for an expanded corn crib that would increase his cob inventory for the following heating season. Safety improvements became apparent as households gained experience with the controlled combustion techniques that cob burning required. Sorensen documented significantly reduced chimney maintenance requirements among adopting families, with creosote accumulation rates approximately 30% lower than conventional wood burning produced. The consistent combustion temperatures maintained by properly managed cob fires reduced both fire hazards and the thermal stress that contributed to premature stove failure. However, the adoption process also revealed important limitations and failure modes that prevented universal implementation. Two households that attempted cob burning without proper fuel preparation or draft control modifications experienced poor results that reinforced skepticism among remaining holdouts. Cobs that retained excessive moisture produced heavy smoke and disappointing heat output, while improvised baffle installations that lacked proper clearances created dangerous overheating conditions. Jens Sorensen's blacksmith shop became the center of a small manufacturing operation as demand grew for the hardware modifications essential to successful cob burning. By spring, he had fabricated 10 baffle assemblies and 6 hinge draft gates for cook stoves throughout the township, each unit custom fitted to specific stove models and adjusted based on accumulated operational experience. His most successful innovation was a removable baffle design that allowed seasonal conversion between wood and cob burning as fuel availability and heating demands changed. The refinements that emerged from broader adoption improved upon Halvorsen's original design in several important ways. Sorensen developed a sheet metal warming shelf that could be positioned above the stove's cooking surface, using waste heat to pre-dry cob charges before feeding. This modification prevented the temperature drops that occurred when cold, damp fuel was added to active fires, and ensured more consistent combustion throughout the heating cycle. One neighbor, inspired by the systematic approach to fuel management that cob burning required, fabricated a graduated measuring scoop that delivered consistent charge weights without requiring scales or extensive calculation. The device, calibrated to deliver 2-pound fuel increments, simplified the feeding regimen and reduced the operator skill required for successful system management. This practical innovation helped less experienced users achieve results comparable to Halvorsen's carefully measured approach. Agricultural validation of the heating method came through publications that reached beyond the immediate community. The county's agricultural correspondent, who submitted seasonal reports to regional farm papers, documented the cob burning experiment and its measured results in a detailed account that appeared in the Iowa Homestead during March. His article included Whitcomb's temperature data, Sorensen's baffle dimensions, and fuel consumption figures that allowed readers throughout corn-growing regions to evaluate the method's applicability to their own situations. The published account described feed rates of 80 to 95 pounds of cobs daily for adequate heating during severe weather, stacked temperature targets between 425 and 525 degrees Fahrenheit, and the 15-degree interior temperature advantage that proper implementation delivered. These specifications provided guidance for potential adopters while establishing performance standards that could be verified through measurement rather than subjective impression. Recognition of the method's legitimacy appeared in agricultural bulletins and extension publications that began listing biomass heat values for common farm fuels. Corn cobs were formally acknowledged as delivering 7,500 to 8,500 BTUs per pound when properly dried and burned, specifications that validated through scientific measurement what Halvorsen had proven through practical application. The inclusion of cobs alongside established fuels like wood and coal represented official acceptance of agricultural waste as a legitimate heating resource. The practice evolved beyond emergency expedient to become integrated into the township's normal winter routine. Households that had adopted cob burning began planning their corn production and processing with fuel generation as a secondary consideration, allocating storage space and labor for proper cob preparation alongside grain handling. The method became part of the agricultural cycle, rather than a separate heating system, with fuel quality and inventory management incorporated into standard farming practices. By the following autumn, the technique had settled into community memory alongside other established frontier adaptations. References to cob burning appeared in local histories and letters as an ordinary rather than exceptional choice when wood was scarce or expensive. The practice spread through informal networks to neighboring townships and counties, carried by farmers who had witnessed its effectiveness during the harsh winter and could provide practical guidance for implementation. The lesson that emerged transcended specific technical details to embody a broader principle of frontier resource management. Survival and prosperity favored those who could recognize value in materials that others discarded, apply systematic thinking to practical problems, and persist through initial skepticism to prove unconventional approaches through measurable results. Fuel was what industrious settlers made of abundance. Buildable lumber was what they preserved through intelligent choices about what deserved burning.